Hi.
I've been a husband for 15 years, and a father for 13. The thing about marriage is, you think you know someone, until you don't. My name is Jack, and last Thursday, I flew home a day early from a business trip. I thought it'd be a fun surprise for my wife Shay and our daughter Lacy. Instead, it was the kind of surprise that makes you wish you never left the airport. I came home around 9 p.m. The house was quiet, lights dimmed, but not in a peaceful way, more like something wasn't right. At first, I thought they were asleep. I carried my bags upstairs, tiptoeing to keep my surprise intact. That's when I heard it. Laughter. Not Shay's usual warm chuckle, but a flirtatious, younger-sounding laugh echoing from the master bedroom. I froze, my heart racing. I walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last. It wasn't just her voice. There was another, a man's, younger and cocky. Max, I learned later, was his name. My wife and her lover didn't hear me open the door. You'd think catching your wife in bed with someone else is the worst thing a man can face. I thought so too, until I turned to leave and saw the light under my daughter's door. Out of habit, I knocked lightly, calling her name. Instead of the usual "come in, Dad," there was a rushed shuffle and murmurs. Confused, I pushed the door open. There was Lacy, my 18-year-old daughter, sitting too close for comfort with a guy I'd never met. His name, as I'd learned through clenched teeth later, was Lucas. The look on her face wasn't guilt. It was defiance. "What are you doing home, Dad?" she said flatly, like I was the one who owed an explanation. "I live here," I managed, barely holding back my anger. Lucas stood up, trying to act tough, but the sweat on his brow gave him away. "We were just hanging out," he stammered. "Get out," I ordered, pointing at the door. When he hesitated, I barked louder now. He scrambled, mumbling apologies on his way past me. I turned back to Lacy, expecting regret, or at least shame. Instead, she rolled her eyes. "It's not a big deal, Dad. Chill. Chill." My daughter just dismissed me like I was some random guy scolding her for jaywalking. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Your mother and I raised you better than this," I said, barely recognizing my own voice, thick with disbelief. "Guess you didn't raise her that well either," she snapped, smirking. I had nothing. No comeback, no words. Just the sound of my wife's laughter, now muffled through the walls, hitting me like a gut punch. I walked out without another word. Shay was waiting for me at the top of the stairs, wrapped in a robe she clearly threw on in a hurry. "Jack, I can explain," she started. "Don't bother." My voice was cold, almost unrecognizable. I brushed past her, went to the guest room, and locked the door. That night, while Shay and Lacy acted like nothing happened, I made plans to leave. Quietly, without confrontation. I'd let my actions do the talking. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I hadn't slept, really. The whole night, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing between disbelief and rage. But by 5 a.m., one thing was clear: I wasn't going to stay in that house another second. I didn't storm into the master bedroom. I didn't yell at Shay or demand explanations from Lacy. That wasn't my style. If they wanted to treat me like I was invisible, fine. I could disappear. I packed quietly, essentials only. My suits, my laptop, and a small duffel bag of clothes. I left the rest behind, not because I didn't want it, but because the house itself had become toxic. It wasn't my home anymore. Before walking out, I took one last look at my wedding photo on the wall by the stairs. Shay was glowing in her white dress, her arm looped through mine. I used to love that photo, but now it felt like a bad joke. With a bitter smile, I pulled it off the wall, laid it face down on the console table, and walked out. I didn't go far. Just checked into a hotel a few towns over. I needed a day to think, figure out my next move. Sitting on the edge of the stiff hotel bed, I made a list. Bank accounts, cancel Shay's access. Legal consultation, find the best divorce lawyer in town. Lacy's privileges, car, phone, college fund. All of it was under my control, and I wasn't going to bankroll her rebellion. By 9 a.m., I was on the phone with my bank. Cutting off Shay was easier than I thought. She'd been a stay-at-home mom since Lacy was born, so the accounts were all in my name. I canceled her credit cards and transferred everything out of our joint savings. She'd have enough cash for groceries, but that was it. The lawyer was next. I didn't settle for just anyone. I found someone known for handling messy divorces, the kind where one side gets everything and the other is left with scraps. Shay didn't deserve a clean break after what she did. By noon, I was in his office, laying out every detail. The younger man. The lies. The sheer disrespect. He nodded as I talked, scribbling notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "This will take time, but we'll make sure you're protected. As for custody over your assets, you're in good shape." That was all I needed to hear. The blowback. Later that evening, I turned off my phone and let Shay stew in silence. Sure enough, when I checked it the next morning, I had a flood of missed calls and texts. "Shay, Jack, come home. We need to talk." "Shay, I can explain. It's not what it looked like." "Shay, you can't just leave like this." There were a few from Lacy, too. "Lacy, Dad, why are you being so dramatic?" "Lacy, Mom said you left." "That's insane. You're overreacting." "Lacy, we're not perfect, but we're still family." Family. That word made me laugh bitterly. I didn't respond to any of it. Instead, I called my lawyer again and asked him to expedite things. Taking control. That same day, I drove back to the house, but not to reconcile. I was there to make it clear this wasn't just a phase. I was done. Shay's car was in the driveway, but Lacy's wasn't. Good. I didn't need her smug attitude making things worse. When I walked in, Shay was waiting in the living room. She looked awful, hair messy, eyes puffy like she hadn't slept either. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the laughter I heard from behind that bedroom door. "Jack," she started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to finalize this." Her face fell. "What do you mean finalize?" I handed her a copy of the legal papers my lawyer had drafted. Divorce, financial separation, the whole package. She stared at it, her hands trembling. "You don't mean this," she whispered. "You're just angry. We can work through this." "No, Shay. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." Her expression shifted, first disbelief, then anger. "So you're just going to throw away 15 years? Just like that?" I smiled grimly. "You threw it away first." Before she could respond, I walked upstairs and grabbed the rest of my things. Shay followed me, begging, cursing, crying, all in one breath. I didn't stop. As I walked out the door, she yelled, "You're going to regret this, Jack. You're ruining our family." I didn't look back. The next few days were quiet, at least on the surface. Shay and Lacy were still blowing up my phone, but I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to respond until I was ready. I needed control over the situation, and for the first time in years, I finally had it. I started by calling Lacy's college. I'd been paying her tuition out of pocket, proud to give her opportunities one never had. That pride was gone now. I asked the school's financial office to transfer the remaining balance for the semester to my account. They hesitated but complied when I told them I was the sole provider. Next, I called the dealership where her car was leased. I didn't even have to explain much, just told them I was terminating the agreement. By the end of the day, Lacy was carless and faced with a new reality. That evening, Shay finally showed up at the hotel. She must have guessed where I was staying because I hadn't shared my location with anyone. I heard the knock, ignored it, and waited. After a few minutes, she slid a note under the door. "Jack, please talk to me. For Lacy's sake if not for mine. You don't understand what you're doing to this family." The irony of her words almost made me laugh. Confrontation with Lacy. A day later, Lacy called, her voice sharp and accusatory. "What's your problem, Dad? Why are you canceling my car? My tuition? You can't just cut me off." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice calm. "You made your choices, Lacy. Now I'm making mine." "What is that supposed to mean?" she shot back, clearly furious. "It means you need to take responsibility for your actions. The privileges you had were based on respect for this family, for me as your father. You threw that respect away." There was a long pause before she responded, her voice quieter. "It wasn't about disrespect. I'm 18, Dad. I can make my own decisions." "You're right," I said, leaning forward. "And I'm making mine." "You're an adult now, Lacy. You want to act like one? Fine. But adults pay their own way. They earn their independence. Consider this your first lesson. She hung up without another word. Shay's plea. That evening, Shay tried again, this time with a video call. Against my better judgment, I picked up. Her face filled the screen, tear-streaked and desperate. "Jack, you can't do this. You're tearing us apart." "You already did that," I replied coldly. She sighed heavily, clearly trying to steady her voice. "It wasn't serious with Max. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking straight. We've been distant, Jack, and I was lonely." Her excuses hit me like static, familiar, meaningless noise. "Don't blame me for your choices," I said. "You were lonely? So you brought a stranger into our bed while our daughter was upstairs? That's not loneliness, Shay. That's selfishness." She tried again. "What about Lacy? She needs her father. You're punishing her for something she didn't do." My laugh was bitter. "Didn't do? Shay, I found her with that boy under the same roof where you were cheating. She didn't care about me. Why should I care about maintaining the lifestyle she's used to?" Her tears flowed harder. "This isn't you, Jack. You're not like this." "You're right," I said quietly. "The Jack you knew, the one who sacrificed everything for this family, is gone. You killed him." I ended the call before she could reply. The fallout begins. By the next week, the fallout from my actions was evident. Shay had reached out to a few mutual friends, trying to garner sympathy. Unfortunately for her, the story of her infidelity and Lacy's defiance spread fast. I didn't have to say a word. People drew their own conclusions. The few friends I confided in assured me that Shay was finding it hard to defend herself. "She's trying to justify it," one of them said over coffee. "But nobody's buying it." "Max? Seriously? She's humiliated herself." Lacy, meanwhile, started posting cryptic messages online about family betrayal and losing everything. The comments were a mix of sympathy and skepticism. I ignored it. As for me, I focused on the next steps. I found a temporary apartment downtown and started building a new life. It wasn't much, just a quiet space where I could think and plan without distractions. A letter from Lacy. Then one evening, I got an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Lacy. The envelope was plain, her handwriting neat but rushed. Inside, a single page. "Dad, I know I messed up. I shouldn't have talked to you the way I did, and I'm sorry. I don't know why I acted like that. I guess I thought you'd never leave, no matter what we did. But you did. And now everything feels broken. I miss you. I miss us. I don't want things to stay like this. Please, can we talk? I'll listen this time. Love. Lacy ****. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sliver of hope. Lacy's letter sat on my desk for hours before I touched it again. Her words felt genuine, but trust isn't something you rebuild overnight. I couldn't just forget how she'd looked me in the eye with indifference, or how she defended her actions like I was the problem. Still, I knew I couldn't ignore her forever. If she was truly remorseful, maybe she deserved a chance to prove it. I waited 2 days before calling her. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Dad." "Yes, it's me," I said. "I got your letter." She let out a breath I hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you for calling. I meant everything I wrote." "Then we'll see," I said firmly. "I need actions, not just words. If you're serious about fixing this, it's going to take effort. You understand that?" "I do," she said quickly. "Just tell me what I need to do." "I'll think about it," I replied, not wanting to rush into anything. "But for now, no more Lucas, and no more excuses." Her voice wavered. "Okay, Dad. I promise." I ended the call without lingering. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Shay's next move. Meanwhile, Shay wasn't taking things as gracefully. I received an email from her the next morning, a long rambling message accusing me of being cold and vindictive. She claimed I was overreacting, that I destroyed our family more than her affair ever could. At the bottom she wrote, "If you want to see Lacy again, you're going to have to work with me. She needs both of us, Jack." I didn't reply. I forwarded the email to my lawyer instead. Testing the waters. That weekend, I met Lacy for coffee at a small cafe near her campus. She looked nervous, her usual confidence subdued. "I'm glad you came," she said as I sat down. "I'm here because I need to understand," I said, skipping any pleasantries. Why did you treat me like the bad guy when I came home? Why was it so easy for you to write me off? She looked down at her coffee, fidgeting with the lid. I don't know, Dad. I was angry, I guess. You were always this constant. The Rock. I didn't think you'd actually leave. Her honesty caught me off guard. That's not an excuse, Lacy. Being hurt doesn't give you the right to hurt others. I know, she said softly. I messed up. I see that now. I studied her face. She looked like the little girl I used to know, the one who'd run to me for hugs after a scraped knee. Maybe there was hope after all. I'm not promising anything, I said finally. But if you mean what you're saying, you'll show me. I will, she said firmly. For the first time in weeks, I felt a crack in my defenses. After meeting Lacy, I felt a mix of relief and skepticism. Her apology seemed genuine, but I'd learned the hard way not to trust words alone. Actions would be her test, and I wasn't about to let sentiment cloud my judgment again. That night, Shay called again. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. Her tone was softer this time, almost pleading. Jack, I know you're angry, but we need to talk about how this is affecting Lacy, she began. We are talking about Lacy, I replied coolly. I'm giving her a chance to rebuild trust. That's more than you've earned. Her voice wavered. You don't mean that. We've been through too much to just throw it all away. Don't let one mistake ruin everything. One mistake. I snapped. Shay, you didn't trip and fall into another man's arms. You made a choice, a deliberate, selfish choice. She was quiet for a moment before trying a different approach. You're pushing everyone away, Jack. What kind of example are you setting for Lacy? I didn't take the bait. The kind that shows actions have consequences. She's learning that now. Maybe you should too. I ended the call before she could reply. Small steps with Lacy. Over the next week, Lacy started making small changes. She texted me updates about her classes, asked for advice on handling her finances, and even mentioned applying for a part-time job. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. One afternoon, she sent a picture of a library receipt with a short message, doing some reading on how to make amends. Thought you'd want to know. I couldn't help but smile. Maybe she was serious about turning things around. Shay's desperation. Meanwhile, Shay's situation worsened. Word had spread about her affair with Max, and her social circle wasn't taking it kindly. Mutual friends were keeping their distance, and even some of her closest allies were staying silent. One evening, she called again, her voice brittle. Jack, everyone's treating me like a pariah. Do you even care what this is doing to me? I care about what you did to me, Shay, I replied. Not about how it's affecting your social life. You're being cruel, she said, her voice breaking. No, Shay, I said firmly. I'm being honest. You've had a free pass for too long, and now you're facing the consequences. Welcome to reality. I hung up before she could argue further. A ray of hope. That weekend, Lacy invited me to her campus for a father-daughter lunch. It was the first time she'd initiated something since the fallout, and I agreed. When I arrived, she was already waiting at the cafe, her face lighting up when she saw me. Thanks for coming, Dad, she said, genuinely happy. We talked about her classes, her plans, and even some childhood memories. For the first time in weeks, it felt like the gap between us was beginning to close. At the end of the meal, she hesitated before speaking. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm trying. I really am. I nodded. I see that, Lacy. Keep it up. As I drove home, I realized something. While my relationship with Shay was beyond repair, Lacy might still be worth fighting for. As the days passed, Lacy's efforts didn't waver. She sent me updates on her part-time job applications, asked questions about managing a budget, and even called me just to chat. It wasn't much, but it was consistent. I, in turn, started lowering my guard. We had dinner together once a week, usually at her request, and I noticed the defiance in her tone had been replaced with genuine curiosity and respect. You've always been so organized, Dad, she said one evening. How did you figure all this out? Money, work, balancing everything. Trial and error, I admitted. And learning from my mistakes. You'll figure it out too, as long as you're willing to put in the effort. She nodded, her determination shining through. Shay hits rock bottom. While Lacy was improving, Shay's life was unraveling. Max, as it turned out, wasn't as loyal as she'd hoped. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd been seen with another woman, leaving Shay humiliated. She reached out to me the following week, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Jack, I'm sorry," she began, skipping the pretense. "I've messed everything up." "You don't have to tell me that," I replied curtly. "I mean it," she insisted. "I ruined us. I see that now. But I didn't realize how much until I lost you." Her apology was long overdue, but it didn't move me the way it once might have. "I appreciate the honesty, Shay," I said evenly. "But I've moved on. You should too." Her response was a choked sob. "I just want my family back." I sighed, not out of sympathy, but frustration. "Shay, you threw that away the moment you let him into our home. There's no going back." She cried harder, but I didn't stay on the line. There was nothing left to say. A new bond. Meanwhile, Lacy surprised me by showing up at my apartment one Saturday morning. She had a small potted plant in her hands and a sheepish smile on her face. "What's this?" I asked, gesturing to the plant. "It's for your place," she said. "It looked kind of empty in here." I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. "Thanks, Lacy. It's a nice touch." We spent the afternoon talking, laughing, and reminiscing. For the first time, I felt like my daughter and I were on the same page again. As she left that evening, she hugged me tightly. "Thanks for giving me a second chance, Dad. I won't waste it." I didn't reply immediately, just hugged her back. In that moment, I believed her. The next week, Shay's behavior became erratic. I hadn't spoken to her since the last call, but I knew she was spiraling. She'd been messaging mutual friends, trying to gather sympathy, and even reached out to Lacy, pleading for her support. Lacy called me after one of those conversations, sounding conflicted. "Mom wants to meet up," she said hesitantly. "She says she's sorry and wants us to be a family again." I sighed, choosing my words carefully. "Lacy, you're an adult. You can decide what kind of relationship you want with your mother. But just know, I'm not going back. Too much damage has been done." There was a long pause before she answered. "I understand, Dad. I don't know what to say to her anymore." "Be honest," I said simply. Shay's plea. A few days later, Shay showed up at my apartment unannounced. I almost didn't open the door, but decided to face her. She looked worn out, her confidence replaced by desperation. "Jack, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. I stepped aside, letting her in. "Say what you need to say." She sat on the edge of the couch, fidgeting with her hands. "I've lost everything. You, Lacy, my friends. Even Max is gone." I stayed silent, watching her struggle to find the right words. "I don't know why I did it," she continued. "Maybe I was selfish or scared of growing old. But I know I made the biggest mistake of my life, and I hate myself for it." Her tears started falling, but they didn't soften me. "Shay, I'm glad you're finally being honest with yourself," I said. "But it's too late. I can't unsee what you did. I can't unfeel the betrayal." She nodded, wiping her tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I'll always regret losing you." I didn't have the energy to comfort her. Instead, I opened the door and gestured for her to leave. "Take care of yourself, Shay. That's all I can say." She hesitated before walking out, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Rebuilding with Lacy. That weekend, Lacy and I went to a local park for a walk. It was something we used to do when she was younger, and it felt like reclaiming a piece of our old bond. As we walked, she opened up about her own regrets. "I didn't realize how much I took for granted, Dad. You gave me everything, and I just threw it back in your face." "You're learning, Lacy," I said. "That's what matters now. We can't change the past, but we can move forward." She smiled at me, a genuine smile that warmed my heart. "I'm really trying, Dad." "I can see that," I replied. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of peace. While Lacy and I were slowly rebuilding our relationship, her dynamic with Shay took a sharp turn. Lacy called me one evening, her voice tense. "I met with Mom," she began. I could already sense how it had gone. "And she's not the same." She kept trying to make me feel sorry for her, saying how lonely she is and how everything fell apart because of you leaving. I stayed silent, letting her continue. "She kept blaming you, Dad. Saying you were cold, distant, and didn't care about her anymore. I told her it wasn't fair to say that after what she did. And you know what she said? What? She said I didn't understand because I've never been married. That I couldn't judge her because I didn't know what it was like to feel trapped. I could hear the hurt in her voice, the disbelief. She's deflecting, Lacy, I said. It's easier for her to blame someone else than face what she did. I know, but it's frustrating. She kept saying I was taking your side, like this is some kind of war. It's not, I said firmly. This isn't about sides. It's about right and wrong. She needs to take accountability, not turn this into a game of blame. Lacy sighed. I told her I couldn't keep talking to her if she couldn't be honest. She got upset and stormed off. I felt a pang of sympathy for her. Shay's inability to own up was pushing Lacy further away. You're doing the right thing, I assured her. Just keep focusing on what matters, your growth and our family, however it looks now. I will, she said softly. A gesture of good faith. Later that week, Lacy surprised me again. She called to let me know she'd gotten the part-time job she'd been interviewing for and wanted to celebrate. Your treat or mine? I joked. Mine, obviously, she said, laughing. I need to show you I can handle this independence thing. We met for dinner, and for the first time, she paid the bill without hesitation. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about her commitment to change. I'm proud of you, I said as we left the restaurant. Her eyes lit up. Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. Shay's dissent. Meanwhile, Shay's attempts to mend her own reputation were failing. Her social circle had largely turned their backs on her, and Max's departure left her with no one to lean on. I heard through a mutual friend that she'd been seen at a bar, drinking alone, a far cry from the composed woman I'd once known. It should have made me feel vindicated, but it didn't. I just felt tired. A new beginning. One evening, as I sat in my apartment reflecting on everything, I realized something. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the start of a new one. Lacy was making strides to repair what was broken, and I was finding my footing as a single man again. Shay's fate was no longer my concern. My focus was on moving forward, with or without her. Lacy called me a few days later, sounding more upbeat than I'd heard her in months. She'd gotten her first paycheck from the part-time job and wanted to visit. When she arrived at my apartment, she was carrying a bag of groceries. I figured we could cook together, she said with a smile, holding up the bag. I couldn't help but grin. Trying to impress your old man now? She laughed and shrugged. Maybe a little. Plus, you've been doing everything for yourself lately. I thought I'd pitch in for once. We spent the evening in my small kitchen, fumbling through a recipe she found online. It wasn't perfect. We burned the bread and overcooked the chicken, but it didn't matter. The time together felt genuine, unforced. As we sat at the table, eating what we could salvage, she looked at me thoughtfully. Do you think Mom will ever really change? I set down my fork, thinking carefully. I don't know, Lacy. Change has to come from within, and it's not something you can force on someone else. She nodded slowly, staring at her plate. I just wish she'd admit what she did without trying to shift the blame. Me too, I said. But that's on her. All we can do is focus on ourselves and how we move forward. She smiled faintly. Thanks, Dad. For not giving up on me. You're my daughter, I said simply. I'll always fight for you, but you've got to meet me halfway. And you have been. The relief on her face made every tough moment worth it. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Shay. It was brief, just a single line. I hope you're happy, Jack. You've turned everyone against me. I stared at the screen for a while before deleting the message. Her attempts to guilt me weren't going to work anymore. She needed to face the reality she'd created, with or without my involvement. That weekend, Lacy called me again, this time with news about a volunteer project she was joining through her job. It was the kind of thing she'd always loved, helping others, being part of something bigger. Hearing the excitement in her voice reminded me of the daughter I used to know. A week later, Lacy invited me to see her at work. She was volunteering at a food drive her company had organized, and she seemed eager for me to witness her efforts. I arrived at the community center, watching as she moved between tables, handing out supplies with a warm smile. Hey Dad, she called, waving me over during a break. What do you think? I smiled, genuinely proud. You're doing great, Lacy. This is exactly the kind of thing that shows who you really are. She beamed, clearly thrilled by the compliment. For a moment, I forgot the turmoil of the past few months. It felt good to see her thriving, to see her genuinely happy. Afterward, we went out for ice cream, a simple treat, but one that brought back memories of when she was little. She told me more about her plans for the future, how she wanted to keep volunteering and maybe even pursue a career that involved giving back to the community. "It feels good, you know," she said. "Doing something meaningful." I nodded, my chest tightening with pride. "That's the kind of mindset that'll take you far, Lacy." When I dropped her off, she hugged me tightly. "Thanks for coming today, Dad. It meant a lot." "It meant a lot to me too," I said honestly. Later that evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I realized how far we'd come. Lacy had made mistakes, but she was working to rebuild. She wasn't just apologizing, she was growing. Shay, on the other hand, hadn't reached out again since her last bitter message. I had no idea where she was or what she was doing, and for once, I didn't care. My focus was on the people who mattered and the life I was rebuilding. This wasn't the life I'd envisioned, but it was one I could be proud of. Slowly but surely, I was finding my way. The following week, Lacy surprised me with another gesture. She invited me to her apartment, a modest place she'd rented closer to campus with her part-time job. When I arrived, she was waiting on the porch, grinning nervously. "It's not much," she said, leading me inside. "But it's mine." I looked around the small, tidy space. It was clear she'd worked hard to make it her own. Pictures of friends and family on the walls, a well-used desk in the corner piled with textbooks. It wasn't luxurious, but it had a warmth that reminded me of her younger self. "It's perfect," I said, meaning it. "I'm proud of you for taking this step." She blushed, gesturing toward the small kitchen. "I even made dinner. It's not gourmet, but I think you'll survive." We ate together at her tiny table, laughing over how her cooking hadn't improved much since our last attempt. But I didn't care. This was the kind of moment I'd thought I'd lost forever, a real connection with my daughter. "Dad," she said hesitantly after we finished, "I've been thinking. I want to see a counselor. I feel like there's a lot I need to figure out about myself, about what I did, and why I acted that way." Her words took me by surprise, but in the best way. "That's a brave step, Lacy," I said. "And a smart one. If you need help finding someone, let me know." She nodded, her relief evident. "Thanks, Dad. I want to keep doing better. For myself, and for us." When I left her apartment that night, I felt something I hadn't in months: hope. She was proving day by day that she was serious about change. Meanwhile, I hadn't heard from Shay in weeks. It was as though she'd disappeared entirely, which suited me just fine. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the fallout. My focus was on Lacy, on building something new from the wreckage of the life I'd once known. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. The next time I saw Lacy, she seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She told me she'd started seeing a counselor and was working through the emotions she hadn't dealt with in the past few months. "It's weird," she admitted over coffee. "Talking to someone who doesn't know me at all but still gets it." I didn't realize how much I'd been bottling up. I nodded, impressed by her self-awareness. "It takes courage to face yourself like that. I'm proud of you for doing the work." Her eyes softened, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Thanks, Dad. For sticking with me." We spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the city, talking about everything and nothing. She told me about her classes, her friends, and even hinted at a new relationship she was approaching cautiously. "It's not serious," she said quickly, almost defensive. I'm taking my time this time around. That's all I ask," I said with a smile. Back at my apartment that evening, I reflected on how far we'd come. Lacy wasn't the same defiant, dismissive girl I'd confronted weeks ago. She was growing into someone I could respect again, not just as my daughter but as a person. That peace was interrupted the next day when Shay called out of the blue. I hesitated but eventually answered. Her voice was subdued, almost resigned. "Jack, I need help," she said without preamble. I didn't reply immediately. "What kind of help?" I've hit a rough patch," she admitted. "I'm trying to find steady work, but it's hard. And the bills are piling up." My jaw tightened. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. She'd made her choices, and I'd spent years cleaning up her messes. "Shay," I said carefully, "I'm sorry you're struggling. But I can't fix this for you." Her breath hitched on the other end. "I'm not asking for charity, Jack. Just, a little support. For Lacy's sake, if nothing else. Lacy is doing fine, I replied. She's growing, working, and rebuilding her life. Maybe you should take a page out of her book. There was silence before she whispered. I didn't know it would be this hard. I sighed, torn between the bitterness I felt and the memories of the woman I once loved. It's hard because you have to face the consequences. That's how it works. If you're serious about changing, you'll find a way. I hung up, knowing it wasn't the answer she wanted, but the one she needed to hear. Shay's struggles weren't mine to solve anymore. My focus was on the future, the one Lacy and I were slowly piecing together, one small step at a time. Lacy called a few days after Shay's plea for help, her voice hesitant. Mom's been reaching out to me, she said. She says she's struggling. Is it true? I sighed, debating how much to share. She's having a tough time, I admitted. But Lacy, you need to remember, she's responsible for where she is now. She's trying to lean on you because she doesn't have anyone else. You're not obligated to fix her problems. I know that, Lacy said, her tone thoughtful. But she's still my mom. I can't just ignore her. I'm not asking you to, I replied carefully. But don't let her guilt you into doing more than you're ready for. She needs to figure things out on her own. Lacy seemed to take my advice seriously, and over the next week, I noticed her finding a balance. She would visit Shay occasionally, but she didn't let it consume her. It was as if she'd finally realized the importance of boundaries, a lesson I had to learn the hard way. One evening, she called me after one of her visits. She's different, Dad, she said quietly. Not in a good way. She's bitter. Angry at the world. I don't know how to help her. Maybe the best way to help her is to let her face this, I said. Sometimes people don't change until they have no choice. Lacy sighed. You're probably right. I just wish it didn't have to be like this. So do I admitted. But Shay made her choices. Now she has to live with them. As Lacy was navigating her complicated relationship with Shay, she continued to grow in her own life. She called me one afternoon, excited to share that she'd been offered a full-time position at her job after she graduated. They said they've noticed my work ethic and my ideas, she said, her voice bubbling with pride. That's amazing, Lacy, I said, genuinely thrilled for her. You've earned it. I hope you're as proud of yourself as I am. Thanks, Dad. I wouldn't have gotten here without you pushing me to be better. Her words stuck with me long after we ended the call. It wasn't often she opened up like that, and hearing her acknowledge the progress she'd made was a moment I wouldn't forget. But just as things were settling into a new normal, Shay threw another curveball. She called me late one night, her voice thick with desperation. Jack, I need to talk to you. In person, she said. I was immediately wary. Why? What's going on? It's not something I can say over the phone, she insisted. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her the next evening at a neutral spot, a quiet diner on the edge of town. When I arrived, Shay was already seated, looking worn down in a way I'd never seen before. Thanks for coming, she said, her voice small. I nodded, keeping my guard up. What's this about, Shay? She hesitated, fidgeting with her coffee cup. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. About us. And I realize now how much I've lost. How much I took for granted. I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said quickly. I know I don't deserve that. But I wanted you to know I'm sorry. Not just for what I did, but for how I handled everything after. Her words were sincere, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully. But Shay, we're long past the point of going back. What's done is done. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I know. I had to say it. For myself. We sat in silence for a few minutes before she stood to leave. As she walked out, I felt a strange mix of emotions, closure, pity, and the faintest sliver of relief. Maybe Shay was finally starting to face the reality she'd been avoiding. But it wasn't my journey to guide anymore. My focus was on Lacy and the life I was rebuilding for myself. That's where my energy belonged, and I wasn't going to lose sight of it again. After my meeting with Shay, I felt a strange sense of finality. For the first time, it seemed like she understood the full weight of her actions. Whether that understanding would lead to real change, I didn't know. But it wasn't my burden to carry anymore. Lacy, meanwhile, was continuing to thrive. She called me one weekend with an invitation. Her work was hosting a small recognition ceremony, and she'd been nominated for an award for her volunteer efforts. "You don't have to come if you're busy," she said, her tone casual but clearly hopeful. "Are you kidding?" "I wouldn't miss it," I replied. The event was held at a local community center. When I arrived, Lacy was already there, mingling with her co-workers. She spotted me quickly and waved me over, her face lighting up. "Dad, you made it." "Of course," I said, hugging her. "Big night for you." The ceremony was small and understated, but seeing Lacy walk to the front to accept her award filled me with pride. She gave a brief, heartfelt speech about the importance of giving back and how much the experience had taught her about herself. As she spoke, I couldn't help but think about how far she'd come. This was the same girl who, just a few months ago, had dismissed me as overreacting, rolling her eyes at my anger. Now she was standing in front of a crowd, confident and self-assured, talking about growth and responsibility. Afterward, we went out for dinner to celebrate. She talked excitedly about her plans for the future, from her career aspirations to her hopes of traveling someday. "Where would you go first?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Maybe Europe," she said, her eyes bright. "There's so much history and culture there. I think it'd be amazing to see it in person." "Sounds like a plan," I said. "Start saving now, and you'll get there." She laughed. "You're always thinking ahead, Dad." "It served me well so far," I replied with a grin. As we left the restaurant, she turned to me, her expression serious. "Thanks for being here tonight. It meant a lot." "Anytime, Lacy." "You're worth it," I said simply. Driving home that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. Lacy wasn't just making progress. She was becoming someone I admired. It was a long road, but she was walking it with grace and determination. The next morning, I received a message from Shay. It was short and to the point. "I'm glad you came to meet me. I've started looking for a counselor. I hope it's not too late for me to change." I stared at the screen for a moment before replying, "It's never too late to change, Shay. Good luck." I didn't feel the need to say more. She had her path to walk, just as Lacy and I had ours. The days that followed were quiet, almost peaceful. For the first time, my life felt like it was moving forward rather than being stuck in the shadow of betrayal. The wounds were still there, but they didn't define me anymore. Lacy called me that weekend with another surprise. "Dad, I've been saving up, and I think I'm ready to book a trip. Maybe next year. And I was wondering if you'd want to come with me. Just us." Her words caught me off guard, but in the best way. "I'd love that," I said, smiling. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future seemed bright. The following weeks passed quietly, a rhythm of normalcy finally settling in. Lacy kept working hard, balancing her job, classes, and volunteering. She'd call often, sharing little victories and updates, and every conversation felt like another step toward the bond we'd been rebuilding. One evening, she dropped by unannounced with a small box in her hands. "It's for you," she said, handing it to me with a shy smile. Inside was a framed photo of the two of us from her award ceremony, both of us grinning ear to ear. "I thought your place could use a little more decoration," she said teasingly. I laughed, touched by the gesture. "It's perfect. Thanks, kiddo." As she sat down on the couch, her smile faded slightly. "I saw Mom yesterday," she said. I stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. "She's struggling, but I think she's trying. She said she's seeing a counselor now, and she apologized for some things. It's just hard to believe her, you know." "I understand," I said. "Trust takes time. It's okay to take things slow." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think I'm going to keep my distance for now. I just can't let myself get dragged down again." "That's a smart choice," I said. She stayed for dinner, and as we talked, I noticed how much lighter she seemed. The weight of the past few months was finally lifting. After she left, I looked at the photo she'd given me, setting it on the table where I could see it every day. It wasn't just a picture, it was a reminder of how far we'd come and the promise of where we were heading. That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could truly let go of the past. The future wasn't just something I was surviving, it was something I was looking forward to.
Bye.